Finally, let's welcome back host of the Kent Film Club, Chris Deasy, to go through some more of this week's cinema headlines, as well as a look ahead to tonight's show. So we were talking about horror icon Peter Cushing a little bit earlier on. Now looking to more modern times, and one of the big releases this week, today in fact, which is sure to scare cinema goers.
Absolutely. Now, I saw 28 Days Later in 2002, rather incongruously in a double bill with The Santa Claus 2. So zombie and Christmas. No wonder I've turned out like I have. But I have to say, I mean, at that point, I remember watching it and thinking, could anything like this ever happen? The desolation of a city. And with COVID, what was it, 208,000 people who died, sadly, in the UK in COVID. It feels that a film like this is very prescient because it shows that, obviously not to the extreme that we saw with that, and also was it 2007, 28 weeks later, but you do have this sense of a film. Of course, we were talking about horror and Peter Cushing earlier, but a film which feels horrific because it could be what's happening outside us. You know, there's like Shaun of the Dead, very funny, but that's a very funny film because we can think that is maybe how some people would react if the horror came to the city. You know, would life carry on as normal? Would you go to the newsagents to get your shops or go to the supermarket to get your ice cream when all around you the zombies are coming for us? But Danny Boyle really taps into that sense that this is something that feels very on the cusp of something that could happen if a virus mutates, as it did in real life 5 years ago.
And there was, I've seen interviews where he's spoken about that there was a real resonance when the first film came out. It came out in 2002, not, you know, all that long after 9/11, and that really showed the vulnerability of cities, as did the film, and we saw those, you know, the real iconic image of Cillian Murphy walking through the empty streets of London. So a lot to tap into with this film for the filmmakers as well since then, with COVID and what's happened from the pandemic.
But sometimes you feel that sequels are not justified. Obviously, they may be commercially justified, but here it feels that, you know how it was at the time of the outbreak of COVID. We were watching things like Outbreak all over again. There were lots of films.
Contagion,
well, which felt like it was almost like the blueprint for what happened in 2000. Almost in watching those films, we had a sense of how bad things could get, but also hopefully, because a lot of those disaster films are quite hopeful. You know, Waterworld. You know, we're given a glimpse of the destruction, but then humankind it manages to show the wherewithal, the resources to take us back from the brink. So obviously, it's only come out today. I will be watching it in the coming days, but whether there's anything hopeful for humanity, you know, because a lot of these post-apocalyptic films often show that there are those marginalized groups who end up taking on the role of saving civilization. So we'll see whether this film is part of that body of films.
And that's definitely something that the filmmakers are quite renowned for. Danny Boyle, director, Alex Garland, the writer, and a lot has been made. You know, we talk about them as visionaries, and a lot has been made about the filmmaking of 28 years later. A lot of it shot on iPhones. I've certainly never been able to film. We're seeing some shots there. I've certainly never been able to film in that good quality. Why do you think that decision was made, and why these kind of decisions are made? Do you think they're gimmicky? Do you think they help enhance the storytelling in some way? What's your kind of take on that?
There are some communities, even in Africa, for example, where they've made like biblical epics on their own phones, because it's like we don't have the big Hollywood productions, but we can do things in our own way. Indigenous groups might sort of say, okay, we will use the technology to best encapsulate what our culture believes in. And I think here that with a film like this, it's almost Danny Boyle. Look, I mean, think of his role in the Oscars, not in the Oscars, in the Olympics. Think how he made Slumdog Millionaire and won an Oscar, of course, Best Director, Best Picture. So he's actually doing something with technology that in a way could be seen as retrograde, but you know, in the post-apocalyptic landscape, well, the phone would realistically, you're not going to have the big studios, you're not going to be filming at Chatham Dockyard. So in a way, it shows that this is the sort of filmmaking that we could imagine happening with the resources available to us, which didn't exist. We didn't have smartphones in 2002.
And just finally on this as well, we've seen with horror in recent years, there's been a real believability in certain into that. You know, with just a zombie franchise, seen 28 years later, we saw The Last of Us, a real gritty realism about it. How do you think, and we talked about Peter Cushing earlier on, how have you seen that evolution and why that evolution has changed in horror?
Well, there was a time when horror would, all be about fantasy, until things like Rosemary's Baby came along, when you started to think it was almost believable that the horror was from within, a film that doesn't actually show us what it presents, like Reservoir Dogs, the famous scene with an ear, but we don't actually see it, but we can imagine it, and that's what makes it horrific. And I think that's that sort of psychological horror is, I think, what makes cinema so spectacular. But it's often that we're sitting there in the audience and feel that we are gripped. Almost, you mentioned the word contagion and the film Contagion earlier, but it's that sense that there's something seeping out from the cinema into our lives, and that's why we go back night after night.
I feel we've had a Kent Film Club episode this night, tonight, all on its own. But let's have a look to tonight's edition. Who have you got on the show, and what are some of the things you're talking about?
Well, we have Peter Taylor Gooby, who's from the University of Kent, Professor of Social Policy. Now, he's done a lot of work with food banks. Also, Ken Loach, that name may come up more than once tonight. Also, Run Lola Run. And when I saw that was one of Peter's choices, I thought, really? But you'll see why it fits perfectly. Well,
we don't want to reveal too much about the films themselves, but perhaps give us an idea of why some of the kind of the more emotional beats of tonight's show and
what really works, in a way, it's the opposite of what we've just been talking about, because here it's communities, facing the sort of, even in relation to COVID, actually dealing with what happens when you don't know where the next food is coming from. Ken Loach is a filmmaker who deals with gritty working class life, often very naturalistic performances. They're not always actors who have, who've been to RADA. They're often making their film debut in one of his productions, and gritty working class life. And these films are very moving and have often shaped social policy, as with Cathy Come Home and homelessness in the 1960s.
All that to look forward to. Chris, thank you as ever for coming in.